All right, good evening, everyone. So welcome. This for us at Remark is also not just the start one event or the semester, it's a whole new year. I'm delighted that we have Rachel Kushner here with us to begin our new year. I'm the Remark Institute's director, Stefanos Geroulanos, and together with me, we have Sam Paul and Amy Nguyen. So I thought that I would begin by recalling a context for us. As you know, thank you for joining us. You will know already Rachel's previous writings. She is the author of Telex from Cuba, The Flamethrowers, The Mars Room, The Hard Crowd, and a ton of essays that you may, like me, have read one at a time until you actually hit on something bigger. And from my perspective, she is absolutely spectacular in taking leading issues and refracting them across narratives that would not have, let's say, immediately been the narratives you'd expect to see wake up. So from my perspective, there was a slight European angle that I thought I would use as an excuse to invite her, not that we kind of need an excuse. And it was also a book that, unlike most books that I read, somehow like ticked every single box in terms of my interests. So post John le Carre spy fiction, boom. Neanderthals, boom. The state in Europe today and what a weird entity it has become, absolutely there. Entirely unreliable narrators, absolutely there too. So it was with these in mind that I wanted to start. So the way that we would say, we said we would try this is that we would start with Rachel reading a bit, and then we would have a bit of a conversation before opening it up for questions from the audience. Good?
Yeah,
Oh,
thank you so
welcome,
much.
Rachel, and thank you.
Thank you, Stefanos. Thanks everyone for being here. And I see friendly faces from disparate parts of my life, and all from an equally close spoked angle. Can everybody hear? Can you hear in the way back? Okay. I was reading from my novel, The Mars Room, once in a women's prison, and they had a very, very loud fan in the back and no microphone. And I was very nervous. And there were women way over on the side. And I said, "Do you guys want to come closer so you could hear?" And one woman goes, "I'm fine." Anyway, I just thought of that. We were best friends later that evening. Yeah. So I'll just read a couple short passages of this novel. The first one is the narrator, and I guess maybe it makes sense to introduce her just by saying that she is on her way in this section to a remote part of rural southwestern France with the intention of infiltrating a group of people who have decamped to this small village in order to try to make a life farming and live communally, and they're mostly Parisian. And she is an undercover agent who works freelance in the private world and has been contracted by people she does not describe because she doesn't, in fact, really know who they are. But there's some consortium of politicians or people with access to politicians and private enterprise who want to control access to water in this area. And so she's on her way there. I am a better driver after a few drinks, more focused. Instead of trying to read my phone or put on lipstick, after several glasses of wine, I faced forward and held the wheel with both hands. Drink lulled me into doing only what I was supposed to, drive the car. Except that I decided toll roads were going to put me to sleep, so I opted for a scenic route on secondary roads. I got lost winding through the Massif Central and its gear-grinding turns. Sure, I was reckless with the clutch, but it's hard for me to feel that rental cars have value. This one, a small hatchback Skoda, cost €8 a day. How did these companies make money? They had brand new cars, You barely had to pay for them, and they didn't inspect the car before you drove it out of the parking structure. The Skoda was clean diesel, an oxymoron that was a metaphor for something, but I didn't know what. Clean diesel, clean coal, add the word clean, and boom, it's clean. My navigation was off, and the scenic route took me way too scenically over a summit. I passed a tower on a cliff, its top edges eaten away like a sugar cone at that point when the ice cream is gone and the child is contractually obliged to take bites of its tasteless container. God damn it, I said. These breathtaking vistas were unappealing to me because they confirmed I was lost. I wanted only an indication by this point that I was headed northwest toward the city of Boulières. I saw no signs for Boulières. I was in remote forested highlands. I pulled off at the top of a summit into an unpaved lot adjacent to a building, some kind of mountain inn, hoping for directions. The inn was closed. Its windows were boarded. There was graffiti along its exterior walls, names and some symbols fuzzed out in spray paint. It had just rained up here. The air was damp and warm and close like human breath. The lot was crisscrossed with patterned ruts from truck tires. A mist hung in the branches of the low trees beyond the lot, as if a cloud had descended on this mountain and left its ragged parts among the woods. It felt like a place of aftermath where something had happened. I peed in the wooded area beyond the open lot. While squatting, I encountered a pair of women's day-glow orange underpants snagged in the bushes at eye level. This didn't seem odd, truck ruts and panties snagged on a bush. That is Europe. The real Europe is not a posh cafe on the Rue de Rivoli with gilded frescoes and little pots of famous hot chocolate. That is a conception of Europe cherished by certain Parisians and as imaginary as the pastoral scenes in the frescoes on the walls of the posh cafe. The real Europe is a borderless network of supply and transport. It is shrink-wrapped pallets of super-pasteurized milk or powdered Nesquik or semiconductors. The real Europe is highways and nuclear power plants. It is windowless distribution warehouses where unseen men, Polish, Moldovan, Macedonian, back up their empty trucks and load goods that they will move through a giant grid called Europe, a Texas-sized parcel of which is called France. These men will ignore weight regulations on their loads and safety inspections on their brakes. They will text someone at home in their ethno-national language, listen to pop music in English, and get their needs met locally in empty lots on mountain passes. The only mystery is where they find the women for these occasions, but even that isn't so hard to imagine. A girl or woman fallen on hard times, not French and without EU documents, stuck in a rural outpost, picking her way out to the main road in impractical high-heeled shoes of flesh-biting imitation leather, aloe in her purse for rapid-fire hand jobs. She had left her underwear in these woods. Big deal. Her world is full of disposability. The panties hanging on a bush in front of my face are a package of 3 for €5 at Carrefour. They are like Kleenex. You sweat or leak or bleed into them and then toss them on a bush or in the trash, or you flush them and clog the plumbing, someone else's plumbing, ideally. I had been drinking, as I said, and I had to go. I was making beer, as a Moldovan trucker might put it. A foaming reservoir filled its makeshift banks on the ground over which I squatted, and then it overflowed those banks, streaming like advanced troops sent downhill. I was still peeing and watching my pee make its way down the hill when I heard footsteps. I startled. Was someone here? So that's enough of Sadie. So the narrator, she doesn't disclose her name to the reader, nor to the people that she's infiltrating in the world of the book. And the only personal story she provides is private scenarios in which she set out to destroy the lives of people, as she's set out to do now. And she In getting hired to surveil this group, she's given a dossier. And in the dossier are biographical materials on one of the mentors to the group. His name is Bruno Lacombe. He's in his 80s. He's somebody who lived through many of the upheavals, hopes, failures of the 20th century. His family was killed in concentration camps during World War II. His parents were in the resistance. He washes up on the streets of Paris in the 1950s, meets Guy Debord and the Lettres International, because that's what you get to do in fiction, is put people through history and have them meet interesting people that you've been obsessed with for a long, long time. And he and Debord have this kind of exchange where he teaches Debord the tricks of delinquentism, the magic of thievery and drinking heavily throughout the day without falling asleep on the street. And Debord teaches him about being a political subject and about the books that he disappears mysteriously to read. And then he goes through May 68, and then on the other side of it, like many in real life, as well as in my novel, decides that, or comes to understand that the factory worker in the city is not, in fact, a revolutionary subject. He just wants to buy an affordable car and processed food and go to see movies on the weekends and et cetera, and decides maybe the farmer, the peasant class in France, like that is where the true unrealized dynamism of a revolutionary horizon can be unlocked, given the history of this region in its relationship to the resistance. The Nazis rampaged through this area, and prior to that, many different series of peasant revolts over centuries. He then decides that, in fact, that too is a cul-de-sac, and that no revolution is coming. Capitalism is absolutely here to stay. And the only option for a revolutionary horizon is one that looks inward and is about revolutionizing consciousness. For Bruno, he decides that some of what he wants to do may be understood by focusing on the very deep past, the time before the written down. I hear is a time of speculation. Stefanos wrote a book called The Invention of Prehistory, for those who were unaware. And Bruno is someone who has rejected civilization, pretty much tout court. He does some permaculture farming. He's on the same plot of land that he moved to from Paris and has discovered on that land access to the underground world. And he happens to be in a part of France that is completely subtended by complex cave structure. Oh, and maybe critically, just for logistics, Sadie has broken into his email account because, in case you didn't assume this already, he sends long emails to the group of young people who have formed this commune. And she's reading those emails and kind of transposing them for the reader. He'd been in these caves 12 years now, he said, and still had not gotten to any definable end, the cavern's design instead calling into question the whole concept of an end. Here on Earth is another Earth, he said, a different reality, no less real. It has different rules. You won't understand any of this from me telling you about it. You might even dismiss what I say. For 9/10 of human time on Earth, people went underground. Their symbolic world was formed in part by their activities in caves, by modalities and visions that darkness promised. Then this all ceased. The underground world was lost to us. The industrial uses of the earth, the digging, fracking, tunneling, are mere plunder and do not count, Bruno said. Modern people who build bomb shelters, planning to survive some version of apocalypse, also do not count, he said. Yes, they go underground, but not in mind of a human continuum, a community. They think, I'll be the clever one, the one who survives mass death. But why would you want to survive mass death? What would be the purpose of life if life were reduced to a handful of armed pessimists hoarding canned foods and fearing each other? In a bunker, you cannot hear the human community in the earth. the deep cistern of voices, the lake of our creation. In my cave, he said, under my cave, welling up from deeper passages, I hear so many things, not just the drip of water. I hear voices, people talking. Sometimes it's in French, sometimes Occitan or older tongues of the Languedoc, many languages I do not recognize, sounds of which I cannot understand a word, but I know that what I hear is humans. I know that what I hear is humans. It is human talk. Did we always have language? We don't know the answer to this. Linguists try to chart what they call glottochronologies. They picture language like a tree with a trunk, the first language at the base of the tree being simple and common, what some call nostratic. This is a fantasy, but who can refute them? They cannot escape the chains of their telos, the sad idea that they are the logical outcome, the advanced form of human speech. They never imagine that if language is a tree, they must look not at its trunk, but at its roots, which, like a tree's roots, might form an upside-down chandelier of extravagant complexity, reaching and spreading deep into the dark beyond. But most people are unable to grasp how far down the physical world goes, and they would not know that voices are stored in its depths. It is hard to explain, he said. You would have to have lived as I live, done what I have done, learned what I have learned, in order to hear what I hear. You would need a different mind, he said. When you live underground, among the things you discover is that you're in a world richly peopled, occupied by legions. Homo erectus, who stood up and cooked, Bruno said. He is here. Homo neanderthalensis, who huddled modestly and dreamed expansively, here. Homo sapiens, gone into caves to paint, to render his capture with extra legs, extra horns, so that these beasts canted and ran over cave walls or butted heads, clashed and fought, all in the light of a torch. H. Sapiens' underground cinema house. That resourceful and ruinous forebear of ours, he is here. Cathars and other heretics, the few not slaughtered, gone deep, living in darkness, yes, present. Cavers, 19th century men and boys, killed by curiosity, fallen in, unable to make their way out, here. The partisans, men of my own boyhood, who retreated underground to hide from rampaging Germans, they too are here. For a long time, he said, you cannot tune in. Then you might sense a current or buzz of telluric energy. This sound transforms the more time you spend in caves. It becomes voices. You hear these voices, but are unable to isolate them. It takes years to learn how to listen, to differentiate, to adjust your inner tuner to a position on the atemporal bandwidth of the underground world. Remember shortwave transmission? He asked them. Probably you don't, he answered. Tuning into shortwave used to be an art, Bruno said. Depending on the bandwidth, it worked best at night. There was a book, he said, that listed programs by calendar schedule and megahertz. You learned to listen for where to put the dial in order to hear a Bulgarian choir or news from Senegal or Venezuela's Radio Juventud. Shortwave is real, of course, he said. It is also a metaphor. I bring it up not to reminisce over dead technologies, but to help you understand. Cave frequencies, he said, are not 3 to 30 megahertz. Cave bandwidth crosses moments, eras, epochs, eons. You have to learn to get inside the monophony, to tease it apart. Eventually, you encounter an extraordinary polyphony. You begin to sort, to filter. You hear whispers, laughters, murmurs, pleas. There's a feeling that everyone is here. A wonderful feeling, I should add, because suddenly you realize how alone we have been, how isolated, to be trapped, stuck in calendar time, and cut off from everyone who came before us. I never want to be that alone again, he said. And that's the end of that, Bruno.
I love that. So
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you, first of all. Can I ask you, with the both of the passages that you selected. There's a
Yeah.
real vision of rural, not even life exactly, of the sort of collateral of infrastructure in one version and a kind of escape even from this. This is in some respects your most rural book, or rural is not really a word here exactly that pertains. It's a sort of, is it the country? Is it, is it a kind of, it's not even exactly an outdoors. There's a kind of fantasy of rewilding that comes with the people at Le Moulin, the small collective. I'm very curious how you designed all this. And then that Ministry of Rural Coherence, which is the most French title ever to come up with. So
it's, it's made up like people, I don't know, anyway.
it sounded real. That's Ministry of Rural Coherence,
Like,
something that
it's kind of like you have to be Belgium, like Jacques Brel to be truly French or something. Like you have to be from the fake ministry to be yeah. So the few things I want to respond to. The narrator who I mentioned, Sadie, has been contracted to infiltrate these people and really screw them over. If they are not planning any kind of sabotage, she will make sure that somebody there plans it or that she plans it for them. And she's meanwhile been asked to tail a French minister who is of Spanish origin. And he shares certain characteristics with the French politician Manuel Valls. And, Manuel Valls was the prime minister. And prior to that, he was the minister of the interior, meaning like top cop in France. And I didn't think I had it in me. I mean, just in terms of my technical skills and also my gumption to knock off a prime minister. So I demoted him radically to deputy sub-minister of a ministry that is a kind of, I blended two different actual ministries to form the Ministry of Rural Coherence. Sorry, it's been a long day. Kind of suggests a program, does it not? Like, then maybe they want to make it coherent by controlling the water supply. I never thought about it till just now. And by introducing the miracle of monocrop economies to make life easier and more efficient for people who have been trying to grow, a diversity of crops and foods, and a lot of people attempting to make a living as dairy farmers, which, in the real world, as in my book, has become very, very difficult because of the price setting of the EU. In terms of it being the country and the rewilding, that's interesting to hear you say that. I mean, it's true. The first passage I read is sort of gives you elements of the dystopic infrastructural real. I mean, a lot of those autoroutes, I think, are built by the European Union. But nonetheless, the French state is very, very present, even there. You see those guys out there in the blue pants with the reflective band around the cuff. And if you spend a lot of time driving around remote parts of France, what people call La France profonde, indeed, that is a part of France. Like the way that the state is so ever present, and the way it provides jobs for people. And so Sadie is giving only one view of France, but I did also call upon my own love for what I do believe is a genuine rural France that you can feel is hundreds and thousands of years old. I mean, I spent time in a part of France where this book is sort of set, although it's called fictionally the Guyenne, which is an old name for lower part of France. Where I go, there's a path between two villages that the mailman used to take. And it's a path that goes under a limestone shelf. And you can see in the limestone where people used to hang animal skins. And you realize when you see those little notches in the stone that you are walking through people's rooms, and that people have been using this path for maybe 100,000 years. And this is an area where some of the first Neanderthal art was found in France. And it was found on private property, and it's still owned by the people that owned that land. And like the family who owned it, the woman is now mayor of the town, but they don't really have a mayor, and she makes replica Neanderthal jewelry. And there's this like kind of like, like little side industry that's built up around this, but you feel this kind of ancient thing there. And you meet a farmer who still speaks Occitan with his 100-year-old mother. and brings out for you, or as he did for me, a box of all of his relics that he collected from riverbeds and from his garden. And some of it is like, this guy picked up a rock for me and he said, this is 500,000 years old. And an anthropologist from Bordeaux told us that. And he said, like, this is an ancient tool. And I looked at it and thought, like, what is it used for besides head smashing, you know?
Yeah.
But so like that history and feeling is there. And in terms of rewilding, the group writes to Bruno, who tells them that tobacco is an old world plant, because the first line of the book is that the second line of the book, well, first and second, Neanderthals were prone to depression. He said they were prone to addiction too, and especially smoking. And he's just riffing off of, maybe he saw somewhere that there's some gene that's related to habit forming activities, and then goes towards smoking. And then they say, but, you know, we've been focused on rewilding this area and consider tobacco to be an invasive plant that would have come from the New World. And then he has an whole argument for them about how they have everything upside down. But I myself am kind of interested in the rewilding project. Like,
Yeah.
I believe in native plants. And there are people who've moved back to these areas in France
Right.
to try to figure out how to farm in a way that is sustainable, not just for them, but for the landscape.
Right. And then a lot of this then becomes the political project that they're undertaking. So am I right to sort of, there are other sides to this, to the region, the whole Kagop plot line, but I'll
Yeah.
leave that aside a little bit,
Okay.
for at least for now. But so there's a way in which you tell, much as you tell the story of the Red Brigades indirectly and the Flamethrowers, there's a way in which you tell the story of what happened to the Situationists left after 68, not exactly in a single line, but from the Invisible Committee and Tikkun to then Julien Cuba, I think.
Kupa, yeah.
And the idea of a kind of semi-eco-anarchism. Now they both eco-terrorism of some variety, though in practice they've all been what do you call it, let go at this point.
Exonerated or
Exonerated, thank you, that's
convictions.
the word I was
Yeah.
looking for.
Well,
and-
I think they were never convicted. There's like one very minor.
No, but at the end, I think there's an actual throwing out of the charges, and
That's
there's
probably the
nothing,
case.
So it's a sort of fascinating scenario of how you bring that as one level, as a kind of theory, a series of theory developments, like the movement through a kind of anarcho-primitivism to this relationship of like, how do we build a different world? What can be
Yeah.
a commune that follows up? And then there's a peculiarity of Bruno in a cave, hearing voices, and translating these into a kind of super history of authenticity, or of a kind of personal and collective purity.
Yeah.
I was very, very curious about your sense of, you know, both, let's say, the more Zadista approach of zona défendre, which would be zones, attempts to protect from police invasiveness, particular areas or particular farms sometimes,
Yeah.
which have a slightly separate history but are linked. And then this idea of what happens when, you know, when you give up first, let's say, on an urban proletariat, and then you give up on a Maoist fantasy
Right.
of, you know, farmers and workers all
Yeah.
in an uprising, and then you sort of go step by step by step until,
Right.
you know, where you really are.
What
is
Mao
kind of-
calls dismounting from the horse to smell
Exactly.
the flowers.
Exactly. And then so gradually, where do you end up with it? So I was very curious how you know, how you see this. Do you, is it a sort of hopeless scenario? Are you trying to negotiate in the book different ways in which, you know, a kind of visions of the radical left for a changed world are becoming ever more, let's say, cornered into particular spots, and then they try to kind of construct a world. But even so, shadowy forces of government are trying to plant a Sadie Smith into
Yeah.
this, or is it a sort of, one has to be able to get into this internal project like Bruno's in order to imagine what a possibility might ever be like? I know this was like an 8-minute question, sorry.
No,
It's-
it's not the length of the
it's difficult
question
to come
that's
up with a
difficult
scenario.
about it. It isn't the length. It's just, you know, I start to think about the project of writing fiction
Yeah.
and what it is I'm trying to do. Because if I had one idea behind it about what direction people can go in, you know, it's an open question of what's possible. But when I assume the voices of other people in fiction, I became interested in this guy, and there was something very tender for me about him saying to himself, you know what? The messianic waiting is over for me because it's not coming. Like no one is coming, you know? And like that is heartrending, but it also allows him to stop in a single direction that wasn't working for him and start something new. And so I guess it just allowed me to think into a different kind of possibility. And I saw him as having what, for lack of a different word, I would describe in terms of traits as a gentleness.
Mhm.
Like, I think he's a very gentle person. And that's not a trait I understand completely. Like among my own strengths, gentleness might not be up there at the top. And I'm interested in people who have seen, he goes to teach at a school in Rodez when he's young. Like after he leaves the whole Debord thing, he decides to start reading and get an education, and then becomes an environmental science teacher of boys in a school for like disciplinary action in Rodez, which is just a city I happen to know and feel holds strange, great mystery to me. Um, and there he sort of decides like violence is never the answer, and people always have some kernel of innocence that can be attended to. And I'm interested in people who feel that very strongly in the root of themselves.
Mhm.
And so for me, it's more bringing through the paces somebody who has is so centered in their sense of human goodness, because it's really hard to feel that way sometimes.
No, and there's something that you convey this tenderness by granting him space to speak, and retaining that tempo. So he invades, even as the book reaches toward its climax, he sort of reappears with a bit of care and time and time again to make the point and then try to go toward the North Star and how to.
Yeah.
Which I suppose also puts the Sadie character to appear all the more cutting, precise, almost, somewhere between sometimes harebrained plans and like really exact ways of recasting everybody's consciousness
Right.
around them. That is what I took the mirror bit to be between the two of them.
Well, I mean, yeah, she's a cynic and she's amoral.
She
And
was awesome. That's the way that I would put it. It's like a different.
yeah, well, I mean, she's able to judge everyone equally, I think. And so she doesn't come with any sort of ego-born agenda of you're living the wrong way, my way is the right way. It's kind of like she looks at everyone equally, but over the course of the book, she starts to seem, at least to me, to be his only true disciple among the characters that the reader is introduced to. It's like she's attending to him most closely. And I'm realizing more, like when you're writing a book, certain things aren't clear to you, and it's almost better that they aren't, because I was just so inside of the story, and I could see Bruno's whole biographical history kind of unfolding and going back to the earliest part. And I am fascinated by this inner Debordian circle where drinking itself is almost a revolutionary activity,
Mhm.
that you can leave this world while remaining in it just via booze alone, which there was a kind of core around him that seemed to close like, after Debord died, where that was the only legitimate activity. Like praising Debord or writing about him or speaking publicly just meant you were like a hideous pro situ who was to be reviled and attacked by some guy with a post office box on Third Avenue. But so I'm interested in all of that. But like, where was I going with her? She starts to, I think that her position as an infiltrator, an outsider, and somebody who is very antipathetic to the other characters in the book, um, suffers from a sort of profound loneliness that I wasn't really interested in rendering by emotional means, like, oh, boo-hoo, Sadie's lonely. Like, I don't have that kind of sympathy for her. But to let her loneliness reform itself as a weird fixation on him, which, living in the modern world that we do, having a textual fixation on someone you've never met
Mhm.
is entirely logical. And in fact, there's a great capacity for it in human nature, as we now know.
And
So
in literature too.
yeah, literature as well, right. And so like I had reread Pale Fire right
Mhm.
before I read this book, and I just started dawning on me that maybe there was some influence there, like that Bruno is her shade, you know, and she does have a kind of kinbodism, and I don't, you know, Shade is never really portrayed as somebody who is not entirely sane himself, but it's like for Sadie, who she allies herself with, is somebody who thinks he hears messages coming through the rock wall. So there's an instability between the two of them. But I think that the betrayal itself almost leads her. In fact, it puts her into, like, I think, a psychic moral bind where she has to find one thing that she can believe in because she's rejected everything. And the way that she acts in her life reconfirms for her that nothing matters at all, least of all herself. Like she says, none of you people are real to me. And so it forces her then to find one thing that's real. And then it's almost like she's deciding that she's his spiritual or ersatz daughter because he lost this daughter who was killed by a tractor. And that's part of his war against the industrialization of the world. Is by no accident that it's farming equipment that killed the daughter. And then later on, he rejects even the plow.
Right. And she has that one tender moment late on, precisely in confirming that, yes, she hears him in a way. Yes, she reads him, that it is utterly meaningful to her, just as collective is thinking differently about what their relationship would be.
Yeah.
It isn't, can I like compress that with one more moment where you speak of the sort
Sure.
of 4
Of
a.m.
course.
the
Yeah.
4 a.m. moment or the 4 a.m. reality
Yeah.
rather than an
Yeah.
identity. You present it, or she presents it as a, you know, people don't really, actually, I think it's Pascal who says that, I'm sort of confused suddenly.
It's Sadie who says it.
That if there isn't, people have politics up to a certain point beyond
Yeah.
that. It's about an identity, but then the real version is her version of the 4 a.m.
Yeah.
Reality, not even exactly an identity.
He says the affect of French people goes very deep. Maybe that's
right.
what you were thinking
That's right.
of.
That's right. Sorry, that's the sort of compressing.
But it's
between
also
them
right
here.
here on the surface.
Yes. So right. So what is the 4 a.m. reality in a way? How do you think of that as how do you think of that moment that gets refracted out of something, you know, in a way we all know what it is. It's a moment of panic at 4 a.m. It's a moment when one is unable to sleep again. It's a moment, you know, it has its literary history all of its own too somehow.
Yeah.
Insomnia. But I'm very curious, is that like moment that you spoke before of this kernel? So
Well,
there's something there.
yeah.
Curious.
So I don't, you know, you come up with these things when you're writing and they feel right. And there's something, you're having an encounter with your own unconscious and you trust it. And it's
And someone else
happening.
had it too.
Sorry.
So someone else had it too, is what I mean. Like
Right,
in
but
reading you.
it's like it emerges already formed, like the cadences of it, the very grammatical structure of the thing. And so you stick to it, even as the meaning of it may shift over time. But to me, I think what she means when she talks about the 4 a.m. You know, state of being is a state in which you are naked of the clothing that keeps you feeling that you are morally situated in the correct way in your life and up socially among other people. There's a vulnerability there where everything feels very stark and you don't know about yourself and you don't know about other people. And so what she says is, in that state of mind, in that true state, denuded of the distractions of a self-confidence and a set of judgments, that you have an idea of how life should be organized socially, and even right down to things like, she says, there are no politics inside of people. And I think what she means is politics in a more thin application of the term, to do with social structures, political structures, even, God forbid, you know, electoral politics. These are not rooted inside the person in terms of who they truly are. They're part of a performance that is a social performance and also part of what is ego formation. And I think that people are rather fragile, frankly, and that a lot of what they present as their politics is vulnerable to change based on the hunger and needs of their ego in moments of doubt or weakness. And she, you know, is operating in the book, or is formed as someone not like me at all, but like very, very strong. And she has this idea that's almost, she looks at Ecclesiastes a lot, which to me is a sort of like bitter, brutal, frank assessment of human nature. And it's comforting to her because I think it allows her to proceed to operate the way that she does. But then again, you know, she talks about the salt inside the person as being this sort of substrate of character that may have within it a sense of right and wrong and how life should be organized, but not specific, not elaborated, and not used to you know, situate yourself within a group of comrades, or to situate yourself within your own sense of what's right and wrong so that you can go house to house and start judging other people, etc. It's just, it's a blunt way of talking about what is underneath people's motivation, including what they need in order to have an identity. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And I just don't know how one follows up on that. Can I ask one more question, and then I'll keep another thought for later?
Yeah.
As you prepare, when do you know that you have a book?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, after I write the last sentence of the final page.
Then you begin to feel like maybe this is
That was the
going
kind of
somewhere.
tautological answer. No, I knew with this book, I knew more or less. Okay, so the whole book is sort of structured. It's like it's compressed time. It's like 6 weeks. I'd never written a novel like that before. And, you know, I borrowed a couple elements from noir, and particularly from this novelist, Jean-Patrick Manchette, that I like a lot. And his books are very short. My book is not because of the length different, but different in a lot of ways. But I felt like I got permission from him to make things happen and to make a narrator who was very, very active. And he like owns a lot of different weaponry and puts guns into other people's hands and also plans in their heads, as Manchette's narrators do it as well. And his books tend to be structured around a sort of penultimate full-blown fiasco where everything goes haywire. So that was on the road in front of me as like the main destination, just like get to the agricultural fair, you know, and bring the sub-minister in and like what's going to happen. And so I knew once I got there, then I would need to slow down and be very, very attentive, because I would be at the end of the book. And the end of the book, as I think of it, is when, if you are lucky, you finally will traverse the fantasy, if you will. And kind of in a Lacanian sense, like something will happen to you that transforms you, because you end up in a place that feels right. It feels inevitable, as if you are coming back home, and yet it's a home you never knew existed. You couldn't imagine what it was furnished with. So that it's not an ending that is a kind of, it cannot be the plotted, planned ending. Unless it was like a Warhol book,
Right.
you know what I mean?
Right.
Where it just kind of did something ironic and a little bit, I love Warhol, but kind of flat. It has to kind of escape what I had anticipated for it. And I had originally a very mean ending for this book, where revenge would be gotten. And then as I got there, I knew that that's not the right ending at all, because revenge is so moralizing, you know? And then it was as if like a hole opened in the storm and this pink light came through, and I was hearing like a new Pink Floyd album when they were with Syd Barrett, and like no one has ever heard it before. And it was like a different gleam that was kind of hopeful, and I hadn't seen it before at all. And that was the end of the book. And just structurally, it's after this situation that I was moving toward as a narrative structure and device. So I knew I was writing the end, you know, and that was it.
I'm going to shut up for now. So the floor is open.
Thank you, Stephanos. Thank you for having me.
Please identify yourselves before asking a question.
Well, I'm just curious, was there something in real life that sparked this idea that turned into fiction?
You know, everything in real life. Make it up, but it's an organic, synthetic whole that is a parallel universe I furnish from my own life. So the region is very real to me. Like a appreciation for and familiarity with a place and with history. I go to France every summer. I know about the caves because my son has spent a lot of time in them. First as a kid at a camp where the guy who runs the camp is works for the French state in the winter as a hydrologist, and he takes the kids into these crazy caves where you go a kilometer deep in neck deep water. And he ended up a guide at that camp, and so he would tell me these things. Like first time he went when he was 7, they were in one of the caves, deep in the cave, and he felt wind on his face. And he asked the leader, "What is that?" And he said, "Paris Toulouse." And it's like it was the train. And so then you think about like the beauty of the underground world and a sense that you can go there to re-access lost or buried sedimented layers of history. Like when you're in these regions, like I'm talking specifically about the Lot, the Dordogne, the Périgord Noir, you're in these regions and you're walking along a river high above it. It used to be the case that the river was a lot higher. So much of what you'd want to access where life was lived originally is underground. And yet the way that the state makes these incursions underground is quite wild. It's like they're just destroying everything by putting these trains in. And I'm not making a simple moral calculus like trains bad, caves good. It's just that when you ask, are there real life things, there's an accretion of things over the years that I'm interested in. And I knew people, who were involved with some of these communal worlds in rural France. And I mean that I've told this story. I'm worried that I'm nervous that people here have been at my other events, but there was a guy who was had surveilled one of these groups kind of famously. And then, I mean, famous when he got caught. He was an agent for the Metropolitan UK police, and he was tailing leftist activists in England, Germany, and France. And it's like, like people protesting like coal-fired power plants, not exactly like planning anything quite serious. And he was sleeping with like several different women from these groups. And then he got caught. Somebody found a bunch of passports in his van and they surrounded him. And he started to cry and told the people in the group, like, I'm with you guys, I'm so confused right now. And I'm giving the state false information and I've come over to the other side. And then this guy disappeared into the private sector. And he ended up working for the company that used to be called Blackwater. I don't know what their name is now. And that was enough for me to give guardrails to my character. And the interest was, what kind of person would do this, And then, because there'd been another who did it in the US and he had entrapped this poor guy who served like 9 years in federal prison, a 21-year sentence before the conviction was completely overturned and it was proven that he had been entrapped by an FBI agent, and it was all there subsequent to a Freedom of Information Act to see all the paperwork. So I had this idea, and I guess knowing what I know about leftists, I felt like I was betraying them by including in my book details of what life in a world like this is like until I got to her. And I realized by occupying the role of an outright betrayer, somehow it just simplified everything for me because I could see them how she sees them.
What you were saying about the case. There's really something about them. There's something really I think you convey this better than anything else I've read in a very, very long time. There's something otherworldly about the ground world in which everything that is a normal reference frame. It doesn't even exactly feel underground because this isn't exactly the way
It's
to think about it.
Totally charged. No,
Yeah.
you're completely right. Do you know this book, Juniper Fuse by Clayton Eshelman? Does anybody else know that book by the poet Clayton Eshelman? It's such a weird book. Someone had recommended it to me when I was writing this book, and there are long passages that are, I mean, when I say charged, they're like deeply erotically charged passages about going underground. And it's almost like he thinks he's going into the earth's vagina. And it's like this very like maternal orgasmic place for him, but it's also a place of danger. And at one point he slips and injures his ankle, and it's like vagina dentata. And it's like this, sorry, but I just thought like, you know, I felt like I was onto something, and I wasn't going to borrow any of his details, but somehow his read of the earth as always already so metaphoric, and yet a place he couldn't help but go and go again and then go deeper kind of coheres with what you're saying.
It's like there's a kind of, as though above ground, there's this entire history that he talks about, again, from the Cago through the more recent and underground, there's a kind of moment which none of that almost matters, except for the fact that this underground is itself constantly threatened. So there's the life that he cannot have, real conversations with real
Yeah.
people that he hears. And then there's the way in which he can actually think about a world ostensibly with a different kind of authenticity, with the pre-humans, the early humans somehow coexisting with him.
But maybe he thinks, I mean, you know, when you go to these places in France, like the Pyrenees, where there are all these caves where the Albigensians took shelter,
Yes.
you know, to avoid a genocide,
Yes.
basically, as I understand it. I assumed that his caves for him are also places of shelter for people in hiding. And so that all of that resonance is there. Like even if it was a temporary shelter for them, they left some graffiti. It's almost like, you know, like the drunk tank, you know, downtown, under the jail. We all know people who've spent some time there at some point, right? And they leave a little piece of graffiti. And the cave is not a jail, but it's a place where somebody might do a little time. And then they leave a little piece of themselves, even if it's on a frequency.
It's happening even in the famous caves now. People actually even now constantly like scrap off something.
Right,
You have the cave paintings in the beginning.
right,
Johnny was here.
right.
So
So why spy fiction? So was it the topic of surveillance and betrayal, or was it the storytelling possibilities of just guiding people through this?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it could have been a few different things. It was an instinct. I mean, part of it was that I was trying to figure out how to write this novel. And I, you know, I knew that it had this Bruno character who would kind of come up through an imprinting of Debord and The Situationists. And then I started reading these novels by Jean-Patrick Manchette, who kind of, well, it's a few things actually. I met a leftist crime novelist in rural France. And it was sort of explained to me that like after 68, among the things that you could do was become a leftist crime novelist. And then I was reading Manchette, and I was really taken with just like explosive type of humor that Manchette use, and like taking the piss out of a lot of things that are sacred to people, while also paying homage to this form. So his books are both very, very classical and romantic, and also very anti-romantic and very nihilistic and jaded. And it's the combination of those two things that I love so much. Like, I really like Celine. I really love Journey to the End of the Night. And I kind of feel to a certain degree, not in a way that others might notice necessarily, but I feel my own limitations when I read Celine, in part because he's so nihilistic. And I'm not. And I have this the world to me is like, what Allen Ginsberg says in the second part of Howl. It's like, holy, holy, holy. So I cannot tap into that same strain of ferociousness that Celine can, but with Manchette, I kind of thought, this is like uncovering an angle in me that I'm like willing to look into. And then it was the advent of people like, for some in the room who know, like Mark Kennedy, who came up in the press, and it was just so wild that there are people who are infiltrating these leftist movements. And it seems kind of absurd. I mean, there was, after 9/11, there was this guy, I heard this story like fifth hand, but I love the story. After 9/11, there was a guy working in an office in Chicago on like open floor plan. And there were other people in the room who saw his screensaver on his computer. And it was a picture of a Basquiat painting. And it's the one that has the planes going toward the trade towers. And somebody called the FBI. And the FBI came and they interviewed him. And he said, they were like, tell us about this screensaver. Tell us, what does this image say to you? And he said, well, it's a painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat. And they said, who is this Basquiat? How long have you known him? So I was just thinking about that side of things. And also there were practical reasons. Like in fiction, you have to have a narrator and you have to have someone who tells the story and is up close and is privy to different components of the story. And so it was like, oh, she has the dossier, you know, like she knows about these people. And it was, I don't know, it was her looking at them from an angle that was very foreign to me. I just went for it. It was an instinct. I mean, I don't consider it to be a crime novel, you know, it's more like she is operating as if she's in a noir novel. Like in the beginning, there's like some like nice descriptions of the countryside, I think, you know, and then suddenly she's unpacking her US military grade infrared goggles. And you're like, wait a minute. It's like she is operating as if she's in a noir novel, but the novel is by me and doesn't obey the rules and features of that genre necessarily.
Should I take a couple of questions at a time? You okay?
Yeah, however you want to do it, I'm fine.
Go ahead.
Maybe you talked about it a little with putting Bruno in conversation with Dubois, like sort of the real meeting, the fictional. And I was curious about it in terms of sort of the books that sort of appear in there. So like
Yeah.
Sadie's reading a Celine biography, but she's also helping translate a book that maybe is not unlike The Coming Insurrection.
Yeah.
And then Michel Thomas is this character who is writing a book that is like not unlike Serotonin, was what I was guessing.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, like, what are these sort of injections of not real books that are kind of like real books doing in there for the
Yeah,
book?
I love that. Thank you for reading the book. Yeah, she's reading Frederick Vitous's biography of Celine, which I was reading, and there are some zingers in that book. Like, wow. I mean, he loved chorus girls. I don't know if people know that. He preferred watching sex to having it. He was very down on low IQism. That comes as no surprise. And I just thought, you know, she shows up to this house. I can see the house. I'm familiar with this kind of house. Like I've had the good fortune to go into a couple of them. I mean, including my French publisher. Her family has this house that's like, it's already been denuded of all of its treasures, because these houses all get robbed in the wintertime when the Parisians are not there. And I asked her how long her family had had this house, and she said, since the beginning. And then you understand what kind of family you're dealing with, you know, and it's the kind of clash between like you open a cabinet and like all there is to drink out of is these weird sherbet glasses because everything is broken, and there's a crusted hot plate next to like a beautiful old coal-fired stove. So I just thought there'd be like a weird 1970s puffy cover biography of Celine in a closet. And I have her reading it, and part of it is because there's this theme of luck. And when I was reading the biography of Celine there, so he does encounter some enormous good luck. I mean, you know, he's on a ship at the beginning of World War II when he already loves Hitler, but hasn't yet, figured out which way he wants to go. And he's with the Allies, and his ship plows into a ship that's full of explosives, and it explodes and sinks and everyone dies. And Celine's ship keeps going. So there'd be little things like that that just help me to orient her in space. Because it's not going to be the case that just because it's a book, there won't be books inside of it. You know what I mean? So I name the book that this group is known for, Zones of Incivility. And I love The Coming Insurrection. I named it in book form as the best book of, I think it was 2009. And I have different forms of attachment to that book for different reasons. But among them is the tone of it. I think it's an incredibly funny book. And in the way that it sort of isolates the contemporary urban dweller. I mean, it was written in probably what, 2006, 2007, when, I can't remember when it was published in French. There are people in this room who know the exact date. It's written in the early aughts, but it still seems relevant to me now in a lot of ways. Like the idea that we have a wealth of information, that we like license software and like stream culture. It's pathetic, And like their whole thing about like he's in his smart car, she's at the gym. Will they meet? I just think it's a very funny book. So it allowed me to sort of riff on my own version of it. And I like their tone a lot. I never could have had a character in my book who would have been among the people who wrote that, because they have a particular one of them I'm thinking of, a rhetorical style that I would never dare try to emulate. So I had to veer off and make my own people. I wouldn't have wanted to do that. It wasn't the project, but also I don't think I would have been capable of doing that. It would have just been a sort of airsats version, and like, why produce that when there's already the real thing? But to have a book kind of anchors it in time, and it lets you know that the French state may mistake a book for evidence of sabotage, and they have done that. The third thing you mentioned was, there's a character in the novel called Michel Thomas, which is the birth name of Michel Houellebecq. And I think Serotonin is a hilarious book. I think it's his best book in certain ways. It also happened to come out while I was trying to write a book that includes French farmers who face down against the police. So I thought, like, oh, shit, Houellebecq did it first. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and he said, just put him in your novel. And he only has a cameo, but I figured I'm carving out a space that's supposed to sort of smell and feel like a real space, and through it can traverse real people. And it would have been just around the time that Houellebecq was writing that novel. He doesn't need to research an agronomy novel, as the writer in my book claims he's doing, because Houellebecq worked as an agronomist, But it was just kind of fun to put him in the scene. I think he's probably like a very, very dubious person on a certain level, but he's extremely funny. And I like the way that he always kind of stands outside of culture and outside of the literary world. Like, he'll go on a talk show and they're like, you're the most famous writer in France. You've won every literary prize. And he's like, yeah, but they don't stock my books at Mr. Bricolage, and it sucks, I don't know if he really said that. He says that in my book, but he's a fun person to animate because he comes so pre-animated and he's singular. And I knew that some people recognize him and other people wouldn't. And it's fine either way. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I got the book and I look forward to reading it. I'm Sophie Lambruschini. I'm a fellow here, arrived, and I'm from France, or from France and Germany. And so first of all, I'm looking forward to reading your take on this French perspective. And already I've seen some things come alive. I live in Fontainebleau, and where the forest is being re-wildered.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been taped off, and so that visitors don't go into that part of the forest. And the only ones that seem to transgress that tape are the Polish truck drivers and the women that attend to their needs by the side of the road. But I have two questions.
Yeah.
The significance of water.
Yeah.
Is it beyond just the factual aspect that in recent French politics, climate activists that were accused of ecotourism? Water issues, or does it go deeper? And then the second question that's maybe a bit personal, but how did writing novels become your medium of expression? Was it obvious to you since a young age or not? I don't know your biography.
Yeah, okay, thanks for your questions. Well, water is liquid life, obviously, very significant. And when you think about the way that water has a flux and flow through the water table, I mean, it's kind of amazing. It's like, it is Earth's ingenious storage system. It filters the water, it makes it clean. Like, you don't need a Brita, you just need the earth. It keeps the water cool, it is a natural refrigerant. And I had seen, this is maybe about 4 years ago, or 3.5, when I was like executing the book. It took me like 14 months. I finished it 2 years ago. I had seen a reference in the French news to these things called mega basins, where they're taking the water out of the water table and storing it in open plastic lined bays. It just made no sense to me. And they're enormous, and they can control the water that way and control who has ready access to it. But it hadn't become a big issue yet. And it was really only after I finished the book, as I understand it, that this movement, Les Soulèvements de la Terre, really got started. And it was like amazing to log on and see these pitched battles, more in northwestern France, as I understand it, pitched battles between police and like farmers and people who just want to have access to water. But part of the water thing for me was having Bruno, my character who is underground, who can hear the water, and the water is part of the underground world. Like, I didn't quite understand that so keenly until my son showed me like these things called lavoirs that you find in a small village in France. It's like a stone basin where women would go to wash clothes. And you can feel at those places like this very strong energy that it's a gathering place where people would exchange information, like to come together, some kind of community. And my son was explaining to me, the lavoir is fed by a spring that comes up through the cave that I was in. And that cave goes down this way and it goes down this way. And if you go in one direction, it's dry. And if you go in the other direction, it's wet. And he goes, if anyone is in the cave in the wet direction, this water will be cloudy. And it just gave me chills, because it will stir up sediment in the water. And so it made me think about source and sourcing and the way that somebody who lives in a cave would be much closer to thinking about, just water and its behavior and the earth's role play in storing it. The novel, I don't know. I mean, novels are, they're a special way to give a new logic and bring into a synthetic ground all of the things that I observe and see and remember for better or worse, and nothing else quite does that. I also feel as a reader, like it's as close as you can get to being inside someone else's consciousness. Other art forms do fabulous things, but they don't do that. And novels do that. Because like they are the 4 a.m. reality of being like sustained over years in a way, or flights of fancy. And they put me in a different mental state than anything else. And I write nonfiction, I write long essays, but that's a completely different thing for me somehow. So I don't know, I just speaks to me.
Thanks. I've just started reading the book and I love the emails from Bruno.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm like, wow, this guy is very knowledgeable about everything. So I was wondering about the research that went into this book. Was it intense and what was that process like? And then also, I liked that there was the poplar trees at the estate that were also at the estate in the Flamethrowers, the Italian estate there. So do you have an affection for poplar trees?
You know, it's part of cultivation to plant poplar trees in Europe. I just associate it with that. California too. It's just like they're always in a row. But sorry, what did you ask me again? It's a whole other thing.
The research process.
Thank you. I had an event last night and I had one at lunchtime today, and then I got on the wrong train to get here. Yeah, so about the research process, I wouldn't really call it research because it's like Bruno for me was just stored up and sedimented with things that interest me over many years. I mean, like there are some biographical details to his life that would read familiarly to somebody who knows the memoirs of Jean-Michel Mencion, who was in the Lettres International with Guy Debord. He wrote this book called The Tribe. I read that book in 2010. So that's now 14 years ago. It's not that long ago, but it's a pretty long time ago. So it's like, it's just been in there. And some of that book is very mysterious to me. And I want to revisit it in fiction so that I can imagine what the life of somebody who experienced these things was like. A lot of what Bruno says is kind of made up. He's just thinking, you know, like he asks, why do we call it Stone Age? I mean, that just seems like that once you start to really think about it, like to attribute the thing that's left after the Holocaust of time washes everything else away, like the rubbed down nub of the remainder is what we ascribe to those people as the central cultural significance of their lives. Like he says, you know, are they really rock centric and into rocks? Or is it simply the fact that rocks are what is left of these people, when in fact they probably had wood and wax, feathers and emotions and all kinds of things that are just not there for us to imagine any longer, but we have to give them this Appalachian Stone Age. And then at one point he starts to talk about migration. And some of that was just me riffing on the idea that migration patterns might be very different than people have thought them to be. And in fact, maybe they are, because once the genome of the Neanderthal was mapped, and you can correct me if I have this wrong, but once they had an idea of the Denisovan and some of these ghost populations, but especially the Neanderthal, they have a genetic portrait. What they construct as migration patterns, or at least as evidence of where people were and when, regardless of how they moved, right? It looks completely different than what like these poor suckers who are just dusting off pieces of shard have decided is where people have moved from and to. And so Bruno is able to freely say, like, why do we think that people migrated from Africa into Europe? Like, do you walk in a single direction? He asks, you know, of course you don't. And so it's like, I just started thinking about this idea of migration also as like people with a heavy backpack, and they're like trudging and they get to Europe and they put down the backpack and they go, phew, you know, that's not how it works, right? And now it looks like they have found Neanderthal DNA in North Africa. So it was just fun for me to build a character who has like a homespun philosophy and he thinks. And so I just used aspects of things that I think, but maybe like put into a rhetorical insistence that is not my own, combined with some things I've read and been interested in over the years.
Loved a little bit, which is about what kind of waste have they left behind and how much of that waste has survived, and whoever hasn't left the waste, as you put it at some point.
Right.
They're kind of gone.
Well, that's what a ghost population is. It's called ghost. If they see something on the genome that's different than everything else, they know somebody else left their fingerprints on us. You know, someone else was there, but they don't have a name for that person because they haven't found their trash. And until they do find their trash, they will remain ghosts.
Thank you so much.